Greetings and salutations, all my little West Nile virus lovers. So this being August at the time of the video's release, we're doing a communism video. I wanted to release it on May 1st for May Day, but my health started abruptly failing, so that had to take a pause. Anyways, now that we're back in the swing of things for now, we're taking a look at even more leaders of the Second World. It's kind of like the promised part 2 of the video I released last August, I think, where I did part 1 of this. Basically, the format is, I list off a bunch of leaders and countries of the Second World, America and the West's demonized rivals during the Cold War. We never bothered to learn who our enemies were over here in the West, and I feel like that's a shame, so here we are. Before we did the basics, like the USSR, Poland, East Germany, Mongolia, Angola, you know. But now we're doing more at the same time. Just remember, these leaders do not have to be only communist, simply those who aligned against the West more often than not. Remember, we've got a lot to cover, so they may have to be a bit shorter. But if you need a refresher, please watch the first video. Let's go, this finna be bussin' AF, y'all. This is just a tiny reminder that these leaders are in no particular order, and I also know that there were other leaders of these countries. I'm only picking the best known ones, sort of like if you were forced to condense the US into one president like an orange on a juicer, you'd probably squeeze Lincoln out or something. Also remember that the countries in red are the ones we've already covered, so take a good look at the map, memorize it. Alright, back to the video. The most famous leader of Yugoslavia, hands down, was Josip Broz Tito. We actually just covered him last video, but we'll still recap him, just for you. Tito reigned as socialist dictator from 1953 to 1980, his death, so he kind of misses the 1985 cutoff line. Oh, by the way, that dates the cutoff. I picked 1985 because that's, like, the average date of late Cold War communist leaders' reigns lining up. As mentioned last time, or if you just know history, Yugoslavia was an incredibly complex place requiring a lot of bureaucratic hell to make it function smoothly. Tito was able to cut through a lot of red tape and form a functioning, progressive, and developing Yugoslavia with a competent military and a masterful spy network. Unlike the rest of Eastern Europe, Yugoslavia was not part of the Warsaw Pact, intended to distance itself from the rest of the communist world, specifically the USSR. Additionally, throughout Yugoslavia's existence, they differed from the Soviet Union in several ways, like choosing market socialism, with comparatively less planning than the USSR, which chose full communism. Yugoslavia under Tito and the upcoming Two Musketeers certainly did have stringent socialist elements, but to say it was like the USSR is ludicrous. Now, if you're looking at 1985 Yugoslavia, late Cold War and post-Tito's death, you'll be looking at something else. After Tito's death, a long string of very short-serving presidents took after, starting a new chain of governments. They're all very unknown. 1985 saw 2 in 1 year actually, those being Veselin Duranovic and Radovan Vlahovic, both of whom only served for about a year each. Their only real goals were to not have Yugoslavia collapse and to hold the strings together, which, well... Albania's most famous funny little fella had to be Enver Hoxha, whom the internet loves to talk about when they've run out of other historical figures to pin the tail on. Now keep in mind, Enver was not in power in 1985, the benchmark date, but he did die in 1985. We're gonna do the same thing as Yugoslavia here. So first, Enver was Albania's most famous leader probably, and a hardline Marxist. He was the first communist ruler of Albania after World War II, dictating the country for 41 years, through the 1940s until dying in 85. He was relatively good at the job, rebuilding the ruined country and raising literacy to very high levels. He also implemented self-sufficiency both in agriculture and electricity. However, he was also totally nuts in the fact that he was petrified of a war with Yugoslavia, the USSR, or the West, or all three really. He ordered the construction of 173,000 bunkers across the small Mediterranean country the size of Hawaii, costing the government most of its money. Left-leaning Albanians remember him as bringing sufficiency and reconstruction to Albania, whereas right-leaning Albanians remember him as being a massive insane person who built 173,000 bunkers. Then in 1985, you not only have Hodja's death, but also his successor we're talking about, Ramiz Alia. These are the only two leaders in power over the 50 years Albania was communist. Ramiz's job was to basically damage control the fallout of Hodja's death, and also defend his honor kind of, and he also oversaw Albania's transition to democracy in 1992. Alia tried several times to get back into Albania's political scene post-1992, which was to no avail. South Yemen's leader in 1985 was the second of only three men, Ali Nasir Mohammed. So many people don't know that Yemen, from 1967 to 1990, was actually split up between two different countries. There was North Yemen, which had been continually independent since 1918 in the aftermath of World War I, and South Yemen, which got independence from the British Empire in 1967, securing its place as an independent Middle Eastern nation. However, the two never merged until 1990, so let's talk about that. North Yemen was relatively friendly with the US and the West, containing a lot of the Yemeni populace. Its capital was Sana'a, Yemen's current one. South Yemen, on the other hand, was slightly bigger but had much less people, with its capital as the strategic city of Aden along the Gulf of Aden, a body of water between the Middle East and East Africa. So South Yemen was a communist state supported by all the usual, you know, the Soviets, the Cubans, the Afghans, the Hungarians, Honecker. South Yemen and all its leaders, including Ali Nasir Mohammed, tried to remove extreme Islamic influence from the region, instead vying for state atheism, as most socialist states do. South Yemen and ANM, as I'm calling him, also called for a removal of Sharia law and secular education, but there were also many problems with hunger, dissidence, and unification. None were really special to ANM himself, though. So, the president of China in 1985 was Deng Xiaoping, ruling from 1978 to 1989. So going back on what I said previously, I know Xi Jinping or Mao Zedong probably were Communist China's most famous, but I'm not doing them. Why? Because this video is a wreck. Okay, so, Deng Xiaoping, what's the rub? Deng was famous for taking power not too long after Chairman Mao died to death, only a few years, so Deng was determined to set things straight in China. He differed from previous communist Chinese politicians by being far more open to capitalism and market reform than the others. Now remember that the Chinese communists are just that, communist, more specifically, Maoist. However, Deng was different. He was still communist, but not as much. Throughout his decade-long rule, the main thing that defined his rule was considerable economic reform, using the justification of, well, how is China meant to live out true Marxism without some spare money in its pocket? And the government was like, yeah, he has a point. Other things Deng did during his rule from 1978 to 1989, re-establishing relations with the US, a short war with communist Vietnam down south, which they lost, and foreign investment. Oh yeah, he was also the mastermind behind the Tiananmen Square massacre, which was a little hard to come back from. Generally, he is remembered well with creating modern China's superpower status, but there are certainly a few other quirks you could look at with him. The president of Laos in 1985 was Prince Suphanuvong. This is interesting for all sorts of reasons. He was actually the first leader of communist Laos, despite being royalty. See, Laos was a monarchy since the turn of the century to 1975, when in that year, the brand new communist Vietnam next door and the USSR also supported the communists in Laos. Remember that communism doesn't like monarchy since it is seen as an institution of decadence and religion, sorry for using the D word, that oppresses the people instead of unshackling them. Except for this case. For whatever reason, the last prince of Laos, Suphanuvong, must have been a fan of communism, because with the help of his two other loyal brothers, they actually ushered in a new communist regime in Laos in 1975, in what was kind of an extension of the Vietnam War, just now without America and with Communist Vietnam being the captain now. Suphanuvong ruled until 1991, interesting date, earning the nickname of the Red Prince. So what was he up to? Well, he went the usual route, nationalizing industries and collectivizing agriculture, in the humid rice paddies and jungles of Southeast Asia. He cozied up to Vietnam and Cambodia next door, while also stressing a rather peaceful existence with the US-backed Thailand next door. He wasn't too radical, which is always great, but his lack of Leninism and hardlining led to lots of contention afterwards, making the upcoming leaders of Laos some pretty bad catches. Cambodia's leader in 1985 was Hun Sen. He actually took power in 1985, but what's interesting is that he's still in power to this day. Yes, this dictator has been in power for 37.5 years. Now, it should be noted that Hun Sen is not a communist, neither is Cambodia. Both he and his country operate under a weird semi-communist regime with a monarchy still in power at the time, meaning Mr. Sen's only real core traits is Cambodian nationalism and a bit of Marxism thrown in there for good measure. But heavens to Betsy, was Cambodia communist before. If you want to talk about probably the most famous Cambodiite, Pol Pot would be your answer. Pol Pot was in power for 4 years, from 1975 to 1979, but was famous for his absolutely insane communist power, killing 1 in every 4 Cambodians. Yes, you heard that fraction right, including killing anyone wearing glasses, speaking French, and also a lot of kids. There was tremendous starvation, and his rule was so bad that Communist Vietnam intervened in a war overthrowing him. He was succeeded by Heng Samrin, then skip a few guys, and now we're at Hun Sen. Hun Sen is apparently a murderous man who has had several political opponents whacked to stay in power for almost 4 decades at this point, and amassed a sizable personal wealth, which, given the modern history of Southeast Asia, is not that hard to imagine. The leader of Benin in 1985 was Mathieu Kérékou, who was the one and only ruler of a communist Benin. Today, Benin is a French-speaking nation in West Africa and the birthplace of voodoo, under a semi-democracy. Kind of, it's hard to tell. But from 1975 to 1989, Benin was solely under Kérékou's rule for those 14.5 years. It was, at the time, known as the People's Republic of Benin, with a different flag and under Marxist-Leninist rule, supporting the communist world, most noticeably places like the USSR, Hungary, North Korea, and all the other good ones. Kérékou took power in a 1972 coup against the previous Beninois government. He initiated his rule with a planned economy and state management over everything, most noticeably the agriculture in the hot, humid atmosphere of Benin. However, because he saw the economy decline and corruption spread like wildfire throughout the People's Republic of Benin, he switched up the game plan. Kérékou actually ditched communism in 1990 and de-established the PROB, legalizing new political parties, allowing free market capitalism, and forming a new Benin. Despite the mismanagement and failed Leninist principles of the 70s and 80s, Benin recovered after his reforms, and he even won re-election in the early 2000s. You don't hear that one every day. Okay, alright, calm yourselves. I am not saying Gaddafi was a communist, or even a hardline socialist. He was, however, more aligned with the USSR than the West, and did support many socialist principles. So Libya's most famous leader by far was Muammar Gaddafi, who ruled with an iron fist from 1969 to 2011, when he was overthrown and killed in an incredibly gross way. Look that up. So in 1969, the quite young Colonel Gaddafi overthrew Libya's monarchy under King Idris I Senussi, a, to be frank, Western puppet. Gaddafi created the Libyan Arab Republic, aiming to implement a form of Libyan nationalism, Arab socialism, and self-sufficiency and independence from both sides of the Cold War, never totally aligning with the US or USSR. As Gaddafi aged with his nation, he implemented some new things too. His political thought became known as Jamahiriya, implementing a bizarre but weirdly functional form of democracy, third positionism, and Arab socialism. He also totally suppressed political opposition, focusing on a pan-Islamic worldview and revolutionary action through local democratic councils. Public services like education and healthcare remained free, and hunger decreased, as he found ways to commandeer underground aquifers to make the coast of Libya a breadbasket. This all came at the cost of torturing people, oppressing political dissent, and lots of questionable activity. He penned a book called The Green Book, which expressed his socio-economic views, tried to make a failing nuclear program, and funded terrorist groups. Then he got overthrown and disemboweled, and Libya's been a hellhole ever since. So, Nicaragua actually became communist in 1985, and the boss of the operations at the time was Daniel Ortega, leader of a group called the Sandinistas, a Marxist communist group who overthrew the previous Western-backed Nicaraguan government after a lengthy civil war. During Ortega and the Sandinistas' first term in office, from 85 to 90, he pursued various socialist policies at the behest of the people. Chief among these was land reform, a popular theme among Latin American leftist groups, and education. These two were big factors for Ortega, because Latin America has terrible inequality worse than many other places in the world, so Ortega aimed at eliminating these first and foremost. Agricultural cooperatives popped up throughout the Central American nation, so that Nicaragua didn't need to rely on the profit of Western corporations. As per usual, political dissidents were disappeared, and free speech took a hike to a farm-up state, as well as the country's relationship with the US. Debt began to rack up, and in 1990, Ortega peacefully stepped down as Violeta Chamorro took power, who was a non-communist coalition woman. Ortega actually won re-election as president of Nicaragua again in 2007, and with the Sandinistas back in power and Nicaragua socialist again, it appears he doesn't intend to step down anytime soon, since he's been in power continuously, even to this day, for 16 years at this point. Maybe one day, Nicaragua. Also, they have a lot of caimans there. Probably the only notable person, politically speaking, to arise from Grenada was the Marxist Prime Minister, Maurice Bishop. Let's back up. How much do you know about Grenada? It's an island country in the South Caribbean, made up of a couple islands. The main big one is the island of Grenada, with two other small ones, Carriacou and Petite Martinique, 133 square miles in size in total. The main ethnicity is mostly black Grenadians and is mostly Catholic. Alright, so the second ever leader of an independent Grenada is who we're looking at, Maurice Bishop. He overthrew the country's first leader, replacing the government with a left-wing Marxist group in 1979. Bishop's Communist Party was called the New Jewel Movement, and here's a rundown. They began nationalizing several industries like tourism. Think about how much money tourism brings to the Caribbean, especially rich Western clients from nearby America, Canada, neighboring French islands, and Grenada's former overseas colonial masters, Britain. Social welfare programs were developed and efforts to be plugged into the Red World were made. Nearby communist Cuba also helped, building an airport together. This raised alarm bells for the US because a second communist country nearby was Bad News Bears, and the airport could be used to fly in any number of communist nations into the Western Hemisphere. So in 1983, after only a couple years of Bishop's reign, the US invaded the island in a very short, brief war. I will cover the US invasion of Grenada in a future video, because it's perfect for my channel. Bishop is remembered for his efforts to make Grenada self-sufficient, but also having his beautiful island state getting invaded by the entire US Army. Same disclaimer with Libya here. Guyana was never officially communist, but it did lean left during the Cold War and have Soviet sympathies. I wouldn't be doing my job if I didn't represent everyone. So a breakdown of Guyana. It is a nation on the northern coast of South America, with its capital Georgetown, and formerly being a colony of Britain, and it's mostly rainforest. Interestingly, Guyana is actually mostly Indian, at over a third of the population, with another 30% being African descended, and then there's everyone else, like mixed race folk and indigenous folk and everyone else. The Indian thing, by the way, is because Indians were brought over in the 17 and 1800s as slaves to farm the sugarcane and whatnot, and since then they've built up quite the nest egg in Guyana. Despite being pretty underdeveloped historically, it's been very diverse, to basically every group of people getting a little slice of the pie. So, in 1985, Guyana had 2 leaders in the year, both of whom belonged to the People's National Congress, a socialist party today led by Aubrey Norton. However, Mr. Norton was not leader. For the first half of 1985, Forbes Burnham was leading the Cooperative Republic of Guyana, which he had been since 1980. Mr. Burnham, being a black Guyanese, was accused of not letting Indian Guyanese voters to the ballots, where it was discovered decades later he car-bombed Walter Rodney, an opposition leader. He died in office in 1985, where Desmond Hoyt took over until 1992. However, our buddy Desmond did very little of note, and Guyana has been a mess ever since. Also, it's where the Jonestown cult mass suicide took place. So Mozambique is a hot and humid country in Southeast Africa, and what's cool about it is that it has a frickin' AK-47 on its flag. The population is about half Christian, with the other half being mostly Muslim, animist, or agnostic. It's also the only country with all 5 vowels in the name, and most speak Portuguese as they colonize them. So when Mozambique became independent of Portugal in 1975, the Frelimo Party came to power. I don't remember what it stands for. The Frelimo Party is a Marxist-Leninist party that has guided Mozambique down a socialist path with an African twist. The first leader of Mozambique and figurehead of the party was Samora Machel, who has actually made my life easier. See, since Mozambique gained independence in 1975, it has continuously been run by the Frelimo Party every time, so I don't have to hunt down all these different alternating people running the various basket cases that have emerged from the many robin's eggs of Portugal. So, let's look at Mr. Michel. So the war for independence against Portugal was very devastating to the country of Mozambique, and Samora Machel set out to rebuild the state along socialist principles. Like the others, Machel wanted to eliminate Mozambique's for independence, implementing economic planning and other buzzwords. He promoted a varied agricultural sector, utilizing the coal, tropical woods, and precious metals of the country's land, and the shallow waters and tiny coastal islands to promote fishing and marine stuff. He oversaw several civil insurgencies and violence, and right when he was going to turn things around, his plane mysteriously crashed in 1986. Not to worry though, his other socialist buddies took power ever since, and Mozambique hasn't been in the greatest state. So, we reach our final contender. Madagascar is another state in Southeast Africa right across the sea, specifically the Indian Ocean, from Mozambique. How about that? A hop, skip, and a jump. So Madagascar is a large island known for its crazy wildlife, like baobab trees and lemurs, with highlands in the east, a rainforest in the north, and arid savanna in the middle. You name it, Madagascar. Madagascar also isn't entirely African, in the sense that the people native to Madagascar, the Malagasy, came about through a hybrid. See, the original settlers of Madagascar came from Borneo in Indonesia all the way across the whole Indian Ocean around the 500s AD. Then, over time, African settlers from the mainland began to interbreed. Then France colonized them in the 1800s, and they gained independence in 1960. Most Malagasy speak, well, Malagasy, while some speak French and a minority of other languages. 15 years after independence, in 1975, Didier Ratsiraka took power. He was a socialist who overthrew the previous president in a coup and transformed the island into the Democratic Republic of Madagascar. Take the usual communist stuff, nationalizing industry, agriculture, yada yada yada. He sought closer ties with the Soviet Union, Cuba, Mozambique, the rest. But he was also much more authoritarian than the norm. Using his dictator powers, he was quick to put down any dissent, and human rights abuses ran rampant. Inflation soared and the economy stagnated. Facing protests throughout the 80s, he finally stepped down in 1992 and accepted multi-party democracy. Turmoil further occurred when he became president again from 1997 to 2002, but he's no longer in power, so that's good. Fun fact, the current president of Madagascar is a licensed DJ. Hi everybody. Welcome back to Fringe Flix's ASMR. If I wanted to really make this authentic, I would drink water and make gross mouth noises into the mic, but I'm not going to do that. I'm going to talk you to sleep now, because chances are you're probably really bored watching this. So, just listening to the soothing tone of my voice through this microphone that I didn't set up correctly. And just, go to sleep. Think of the revolutionary might of the people through a zeal that is yet untold, unshackling the workers of the world. This could be pretty soon, guys, don't worry. I mean, I don't personally support it. I'm not personally a communist, but I find the history interesting.